I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad.
That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to Totally Pretentious, a podcast about great movies. I'm David.
And I'm Shaun.
And today we're looking at the 1977 Japanese film Hausu, directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi.
A film that David picked, because my pick was Fitzcarraldo from last week. So thank you, David, that we watched this film.
You're welcome.
You have a tendency now of picking the strangest damn things ever.
Well, it's it's not the most. I could certainly have gone more obscure. Hausu isn't particularly so, and in fact, in 1977, it was a big box office hit in Japan.
I know. I was reading about this exact thing, about how popular it was in its time. Quite popular, despite being a very unusual film, and even Obayashi in some of the DVD materials on the Criterion Collection talks a little bit about the sort of ways in which he was bucking Japanese film trends at the time, which I admit I don't know enough about, but maybe you will have some answers to that. But it was interesting to hear him talk about that, and that a lot of young people apparently really liked his movie, partly because apparently he used to show his short films at the universities, and so they just followed him to the big theater.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm any more of an expert on the Japanese film scene at that particular period than you are, but it does seem to have been bucking a trend at that time, even as it was winking at some of those trends, so that it was originally a lower billed offering on a double bill with a rom-com. And the star of the male lead of the rom-com, who was a very, very popular at that time, shows up briefly in Hausu in the flashbacks to the aunt's tragic love story. He's her boyfriend who goes off to war and never comes back.
I did not know that. Well, that adds some interesting dynamics. So maybe there's the silliness, as it were, of this film is partly what maybe bucks the trend, because there's a way in which most of the film is not dealing with those very serious elements, but occasionally it points to them in almost not quite farcical ways, but maybe a little bit farcical.
I think there certainly is a lot of overt slapstick in here.
Yeah.
Certainly it is another film that is an example of the very, very close relationship between comedy and horror. As you've probably seen in the same place as I have, that there were some comparisons made between Hausu and the later Evil Dead films of Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson's early work. And, you can see some of those connections, but it's still very much, Hausu it's quite different from Evil Dead 2. There, for example, there is how shall I say this? There is a heartfelt and darker aspect to it there. But at the same time, there's a childlike quality that I like to think comes from Obayashi's collaboration with his 11-year-old daughter on the story. And it's because it's got that kind of wild, anything can happen approach of childhood imagination. And so the result, the way I watched it, felt like I was looking at a cross between Suspiria and Yellow Submarine.
Well, I can tell you that based on what I've read about Obayashi, talking about it, many decades later, it does appear that his collaboration with his 11-year-old daughter was pretty significant. She even, as I recall, appears briefly in the film. But he does, right? Because he takes cues from his daughter. I mean, the original ideas for this film was he was told he was supposed to make a film kind of like Jaws, because at this time Jaws is enormously successful in the US, so they wanted something like Jaws. This is nothing like Jaws. But he didn't think that the sort of realistic terrors were all that scary. The most terrifying things were the things that sort of bucked your expectations, the stuff that children found fascinating and terrifying. And so he went to his daughter for a lot of these. And some of the examples are, the very premise of the movie essentially comes from his daughter, which is the idea of a house that eats it eats, well, in this case, girls. Presumably it eats other people, but it must have a preference for, it likes young women, especially. But it also, in his decision about the special effects, apparently he helped oversee the special effects and wanted them to deliberately look unrealistic because he wanted them to have a childlike quality to them. And a lot of them really do. You know, I mean, I think we haven't quite explained what the movie is about, but there's a moment in the film where one of the one named Melody is essentially eaten by a piano. Yes. And it starts a little bit kind of, it's comical, but in a almost a slapstick way where like her parts of her fingers are disappearing and then she's getting eaten, and then it becomes a little scary as the piano actually starts to eat her, and then it becomes just completely ridiculous where like her body parts are floating in the air and like she's being eaten and like her legs are flopping out of it and there's like weird music going on and all of these kinds of things. It's interesting to watch. And I think part of this is certainly from Obayashi's relationship with his daughter, but I also think part of this is that Obayashi basically cut his teeth on making commercials, which apparently you weren't supposed to do in Japanese cinema as a director. Like that was like the low form of art because they didn't have, as Obayashi says, they don't have messages, right? That's just basically empty rhetoric. And he apparently had a lot of fun with making commercials and didn't get taken seriously by the sort of Japanese film establishment. And then he made this film, and I still don't think he quite got taken seriously by the Japanese film establishment, but they also couldn't ignore him because he made money.
Yeah, because it wasn't particularly well received critically in Japan at that time, but it certainly was well received by younger audiences in particular. And I think the example you give of the piano scene is, I think, really a case in point as to it, the way it shifts in tone on a dime. But I suppose you're right. Maybe we should set up the premise first. So for those of you who have not seen the film, we have 7 high school girls who go to the rural mansion of the aunt of one of them, whose name is Gorgeous. And the aunt initially appears in white hair, in a wheelchair, but gradually becomes invigorated over the course of the events as the house gradually starts devouring the teenage girls one after the other, absorbing them and rejuvenating her. Which on the surface could sound almost like variations of plots like Burnt Offerings and things like that. But in its execution is so delirious. And the example you gave, Shaun, of the way that the piano scene shifts from humor to horror or are both there simultaneously. When the piano first bites off her fingers, the image is actually rather gruesome with she's holding up her stumps before her, but she's laughing. And then she's not laughing as the piano starts to devour her. But in the final stages where we reach the stage where, as you described, we're just seeing her very disembodied parts floating around. Her severed head is laughing again, and at one point she says, "Oh, that's very naughty," about what the piano is doing.
Yeah, it is the premise of this film is very, very simple. But it's the other things about it that aren't simple. Because the very idea is like, it's a house that eats people. Like, that setup's pretty easy to follow, right? We have all kinds of variations on the, like, people go to a house and the house is haunted thing, and then it tries to kill the people that are in the house. And that whole plot line's easy enough to follow. It's all of the other stuff that I think is where the most interesting components about this are. I mean, in 1977, Obayashi says that apparently the idea of having the house be the thing that devours was considered unusual. I think today we probably don't think that, but we have, 40-something years of foresight now of having seen lots of films in which houses try to kill people. Some of them maybe even try to eat them. But I think what's interesting is, like, if we look at what the cast is, so like you mentioned, there's the 7 teenage girls, and they all have very somewhat comical names because they're essentially almost like nicknames that are based on who each of the characters are. Obayashi's also said that he took the number 7 because in his mind, the number 7 is really important in Japanese culture. Most obviously, I think this could be a reference to a film I think you can imagine, David. What Japanese film featuring 7 might you be thinking of?
Well, the 7 Samurai.
Yeah.
And in his His essay in the on the Criterion edition of the film, Chuck Stevens also compares it to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it does have that kind of fairy tale quality too.
Absolutely.
And now there had been a couple of devouring house films prior to this. In fact, the year before we have Burnt Offerings. And going back to 1963, we have the Haunting, the first film version of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It may not actually eat people, but it does consume at least one of the characters. So we have, these things exist, but this sort of over-the-top body count devouring by a house, I don't think there'd been much like that. And I think even today, there's not a lot that looks and feels like that this film. His commercial background is there and adds to the glorious perversity of the movie, because it sometimes feels like you're watching some kind of nightmare commercial for, come out to this country house and be killed. The ways in which he's constantly fragmenting the frame of pictures within pictures, or even the otherwise innocuous scene where Gorgeous is introduced to her new stepmother-to-be. And this takes place on a balcony, but the camera is inside the apartment. And the balcony's glass doors are closed, and the glass is in a grid form. And so the images of the characters are being broken up by the different squares of glass to sometimes distorting effect. And the stepmother, who seems to move perpetually in slow motion in some privately delivered wind that's always blowing her scarves about, she looks like she's perpetually inhabiting some kind of shampoo or makeup commercial.
Yeah, that's something I was thinking about when I realized his commercial background. There are a lot of sequences in this that feel like they're setups for commercials that obviously aren't, because there's no product actually being sold to us. But the tone, and even often the music that's being played, right, is like there'll be delightfully cheery music playing, or cheesy music, or sort of romantic music that sets this up as if we were watching a commercial for like a travel agency or shampoo or something else. And even like, I think you were kind of saying earlier, there's these mythical elements to this, is sort of, I think, becomes embodied by the characters, because there are these 7 girls and all of their nicknames are sort of very convenient descriptions for the characteristic about them we're supposed to recognize. So Gorgeous is called Gorgeous because she's supposed to be the most beautiful. There's Kung Fu, who's always doing kicks and punches and is like really, aggressive. There's Prof, who's supposed to be the super smart one. There is Fantasy, who I think just mostly is scared most of the time, but that's what I took from it.
Well, but she does engage in fantasies. Like, she's kind of dreamy. She's the one who has the crush on the teacher.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The kind of gross looking teacher.
Yes. Who, of course, who gets turned into bananas.
He gets turned into bananas at one point. That's something you all have to look forward to. And then you have Mac, who is known because she loves food. I did find it weird that the film at a couple points tries to make us think that she's fat, but she's really not. But yeah, she loves to eat food and she's always hungry. There's Melody, who obviously is the one that plays music. She's the one that plays on the piano. So you have all of these like characters that are sort of archetypes already kind of set up that you might expect in something like, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, all their names are like the thing that they identify by, right? There's, Grumpy and I forget all the other names. You get the idea though, right? Grumpy's always grumpy. So, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. So there's like these mythical qualities of it that I think are combined with those commercial sensations that it's giving us that are, I think what you say, maybe at sometimes grotesque, but not grotesque in the way that I would expect from a horror film, but grotesque in almost like a commercialist way, which is, I don't know if that's making sense, but that's kind of how I feel about the grotesquerie. It doesn't feel at times like a proper horror movie, except when there's actual gore. The grotesquerie is in all of the other like mythical qualities and archetypes and the weird sequences that feel odd in a film that is supposed to have a fairly straightforward plot. I don't know. I think that makes sense, but I'll let you kind of jump in here.
Well, yeah, because the plot is straightforward, and I think that's in some ways its purpose in that it's really just enough of a plot to get us there, and then to permit the phantasmagoria of images to unfold. So the plot itself almost, I don't want to say that it gets itself cut up into pieces, because it does proceed kind of linearly, but it is, well, like Suspiria, which came out the same year. And also has that fairy tale quality, and in fact itself was Dario Argento was very heavily influenced by Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the look of the film, and so they both House and Suspiria have this once upon a time quality. You can summarize the plots in a couple of sentences for both of them, but that the plots are in some ways the least important parts of the films. And so to come back to what you were saying about the commercials and how we seem to be, every so often it feels like we're about to we're watching a commercial for something that doesn't exist, or something that never actually starts to advertise itself, and yet the traces of that mode remain. One of the things that struck me in that regard was that the travel billboard that they go past in the train station, which then seems to follow them to the aunt's house. And their teacher drives by at one point as well. But now it's no longer a billboard in a train station advertising the mountains. It's a billboard advertising the mountains in the middle of the mountains. It's just there by the side of the road, yeah, making no sense at all.
And that billboard, I mean, there's like a moment when they take a picture in front of it. And it's really surreal because all the girls kind of are taking a picture there, as I recall. Or did I just make that up?
No, I think that's right. At least it feels right, what you're saying.
Yeah, because they get off the bus, and then I think they get together to have a picture taken in front of that billboard of the mountains. This film is surreal. Like, they're just things that appear in it that are just quite odd, to say the least.
Well, it makes a virtue out of its artificiality, right? So if they're taking a picture in front of the billboard when they're surrounded by actual scenery, but then some of the supposedly actual scenery that they are moving through is very clearly a matte painting, such as when we get the first look at the house from a distance, which is pointed out to them by the watermelon salesman, who looks kind of like a watermelon, and who also was the composer of the score.
Right. He demanded to be in the movie, but he didn't want to have a major role, I think. He just wanted to be a weirdo.
which he does very effectively.
Yeah.
So we have these images that exceed any kind of sense, and like Suspiria, like in fact quite a bit of the horror films that were coming out of Europe at this time, it has this quality of an exuberance of the image and of its possibilities, and much, much less interested than American films from the same period in character development and plot and a grounding in a recognizable reality. Rather, it's taking recognizable reality and rendering it unrecognizable even before we get to the haunted house.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. That's just a really good point.
So I'm curious, like, your first viewing of it, I mean, does it feel like a film that is as disorienting now, over 40 years later? Does it still feel like it's being beamed in from some other planet?
So, yes and no. I've watched many, many things in Japanese cinema, more modern stuff, especially anime. And there is like a really strange quality to not all, but many works of Japanese cinema, whether animated or otherwise, that I think is sometimes, from my perspective as a Western person from the US, I want to say almost feels off in a way that I don't quite understand because I'm not from the culture. And so I'm coming from as an outsider. I don't want to say alien because I think that's not quite a fair assessment. And so when I watched this, like, yes, on the one hand, I could see like there's all of these things that feel they just feel so surreal and strange, and it's hard to sort of grasp them. But then other stuff I was just going like, oh, well, that's just, I've seen a movie that does weird shit like this too. So it's sort of didn't surprise me in the way that I think the part that surprised me was just mostly that every time you pick a horror movie, you pick like the weirdest damn horror movies imaginable. And so that the part is surprises me because I'm always thinking like, oh, David's gonna pick something that's super normal, and then you pick something where it's like, oh God, this is like what it's like to live inside David's head.
Well, and to put my cards on the table, I have to say that partly what motivated me to choose this particular film was it one that had remained a significant gap for me. So this was a way for me to finally see it myself, having read about it for some time. So this was a first viewing for both of us.
How have you never seen this movie?
Well, it was one that, I guess I first read about it, probably about 20 years ago, but it wasn't one that was readily available for a lot of, certainly through the 90s. There's so much of international cinema that is now at our fingertips, but certainly when I was doing my graduate work on horror in the 90s, even most European horror films, you were having to make do with public domain issues of varying quality, and that we just didn't have legitimate releases of, particularly uncut, of so many things. And this was at a period when, certainly, for instance, Hong Kong cinema was only certainly action cinema was really finally making its presence felt in North America. But again, you had to go looking for it. And anime, unless you were talking about Akira, there wasn't a lot that was readily accessible, never mind either dubbed or subtitled in English so you could understand what the heck it was you were watching. So, and then after that, it's just, there's so much out there that there's things you just don't get around to. And so this was my way of finally making myself get around to House. So I'm very glad that I did. And coming back to what you were just saying earlier about some of the stuff that since then, it's occurred to me as you were talking that even though the tone is so different, it'd be interesting to make comparisons between this and the work of Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who gave us movies like Cure and Pulse, that are perhaps more nightmarish, or certainly darker than House, and less wacky in their presentation, but that can spiral off into very disorienting presentations of the world of the film in ways that I don't think are entirely disconnected from what we were seeing in House.
In a weird sort of way, I think you're probably right there. Again, I don't have anything to add. You just say things and then I'm just like, yeah, that seems right. Yeah.
Just listen to me pontificate for a while. You be quiet over there. Sit yourself down in the corner. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. There's just... This film is so different from anything we've watched so far. Because we've covered stuff that I would say is, from a U.S. perspective, fairly conventional films. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It just means that they're not necessarily experimental. They're not necessarily pushing boundaries, right? They're sort of dealing with their subject matter in a very traditionalist way, insofar as that is a medium possibility. Whereas this film, it's one that sort of bucks every expectation that you have for what you're getting. I mean, even my expectation of what a horror comedy film should be like my default is to think something like Evil Dead 2 or Army of Darkness or maybe Cabin in the Woods, these kinds of, be fair, these came after this film, so there's a bit of distance, but those films where there's still like a conventional aspect to them, even if some of the special effects might not be conventional, because they might be fairly cleverly done. But there is a sense of I watch, Army of Darkness, and part of the comedy comes from watching the lead actor, Bruce Campbell, with the dialogue that he gets. And so there's a very clear sense, I'm getting horror elements, but it's primarily a comedy. Yeah. In the way that this film, that separation's not... It's not clear a lot of the times. There are moments that are truly, that in a different film would be, I think, haunting and disturbing in a way. So there's the sequence when, I forget who's alive at the very end when the house has been covered in water and she hugs Gorgeous.
Well, I think it's the last two who are alive as everything starts to flood are Prof and Fantasy.
I think Fantasy's then the one that hugs.
She's the last.
She's the last one. Okay. Then, yeah, I mean, so this whole film, like, up to this point, this is almost the very, very end, but it's like the last of the teen girls, right? And the house is flooded. They're trying to float on the floorboards, basically, trying not to get sucked into the water. They think, Prof at one point thinks that they figured out, like, how do we stop this? You have to, like, destroy the cat picture, and they try that, and it doesn't really work because this is a house that's going to eat you. You kind of have to destroy more than that. And so Prof is dead, and all of them are dead. And then she manages to, like, get her little floorboard over to the stairs, while the bottom floor is all covered. And then she sees Gorgeous, who has at this point been essentially consumed and has become a ghost of sorts, who's wearing, like, a wedding gown and, like, all of these things that are kind of going on. And Fantasies, like, hugs up against her, almost as if she's, like, relinquishing herself to her fate, in a way. And this is when Gorgeous is actually bare-breasted, because that's a thing that does occasionally happen in this movie. So there's that, and I think that, if not for the rest of that film, that sequence would be one of the most haunting moments in any horror film. But there's like always the expectation at that point of, like, well, where's the silly thing gonna come? Like, maybe she turns into, like, a giant pot plant and, like, just, like, eats her or something. Like, just something silly or something strange or unusual. But that scene is sort of, in a way, bucks the expectations of the rest of the damn film, because the whole film has been things that don't seem to connect, and yet this one seems to make a lot of sense and is very conventional in its construction. And this is what this film does, is, like, at all times, like, you think you know what you're going to get, and then you don't get it. You get something you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, and there's a couple, I agree, there's a couple of things there, what you said, that I'd like to pick up on. One is, I think we should mention, one of the cinematic traditions that does come through here is with the aunt and the connection with the demonic cat, right? There is that tradition, and I think the film that best embodies this is Kuroneko, with the idea sort of ghosts returning as demonic cats for vengeance. And so we have that aspect in the aunt, who at this point has consumed Gorgeous and appears as her, but then it reappears as herself, I think, in those final moments there. And you're absolutely right that we don't know when we're going to get comedy and when we're going to get horror, and sometimes, how do we feel about them? And yeah, with Evil Dead 2, for instance, there's blood all over the place, but it's hilarious, right? But if you look at the arc of the Evil Dead films, at least Sam Raimi's ones, and you see the movement towards full-on comedy and less unpleasant gore. So by the time you get to Army of Darkness, it's much more. I mean, the fact that one of the big governing presences of that film is the spirit of Ray Harryhausen, right? With all of the stop motion animated skeletons and the epic fantasy battles and things like that, and it's much less gory than the other two. Evil Dead 2 is really the embodiment of splatstick in a way that wouldn't really be surpassed until Peter Jackson's Dead Alive. But the first Evil Dead is not really funny. It's playing things mostly straight, but its gore effects are also so incredibly over the top. And also the budget was so much smaller that there's a kind of Play-Doh quality sometimes to them. But they're also sometimes genuinely nasty, such as when there's a scene with a young woman gets a pencil thrust into her ankle, and it looks very convincing. So the first Evil Dead, I think, has some of that disorienting quality that House does, where you're not entirely sure how you feel. Am I supposed to be laughing? Am I supposed to be disturbed? And sometimes there's that, one of the early moments of the supernatural in House is when Mac, I believe, is the first victim, isn't she? And Fantasy goes to look for it and pulls up her decapitated head from the well.
Where the watermelon was originally.
Yes, and instead of a watermelon, she gets a head, and the head flies up and then bites her on the ass. And it's a kind of juvenile humor moment, right? Of ha ha ha, the head's biting you on the ass, right? And it's kind of played that way, but at the same time you're watching a decapitated head doing this.
Right.
And so it's like, I don't know if I'm finding this funny or not. It's putting me in a place where I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to feel. And so I think this is to your point of a lot of the American comedy horror films, you kind of know how you feel or how you're supposed to feel.
Yeah.
And you're right that they may have the trappings of horror, but the overall effect is one of unmitigated hilarity. But I also find it ironic that, as you said, that this is very unconventional that way. If we talk about the films that are being designed for mainstream appeal and so forth, and yet here we have a film that was Toho said, okay, we need something like Jaws.
Yeah.
like we need something with the broadest commercial appeal possible. Make this, and or go ahead and make the movie that you want to make. And in a weird way, he did. So it's simultaneously very much against the grain, yet it was a commercial success.
It was indeed. It is worth noting, though, that this is done with the Toho, the film company Toho, and while they greenlit his script, they did not have anyone to direct this when it was first up. So it took 2 years before they finally actually made it, because Obayashi actually finally just said, I'll frickin' do it, and got Toho to agree to it. I can't remember exactly what he did. Oh, he promoted. He spent like 2 years promoting his own film. So this is like the opposite of how it's usually done, which is you make the film and then there's lots of cool promo stuff for it, like albums and art and all that stuff. He did the opposite. He started with all of the like albums of art, like they sold the music from the film, and all these things that they did before it, which basically convinced Toho to say, well, shoot, we have to say yes now because like people are expecting this film to be made, and they want to see this film, and so we can't say no. And so in a weird way, it's very commercial in the way that it eventually came to be and then became obviously a commercial success, and yet also so frickin' weird. It is such a strange movie.
And there was something that I saw, and of course now I can't find it again, but something to the effect that Toho was tired of taking chances on films that made sense, and so they and not making money, and so okay, yeah, do this thing instead.
Because Obayashi talks about this. He says that when his script got greenlit, and Toho came to him and basically was like, well, none of our directors want to do it, because what the directors wanted to do were these very like conventional Japanese films of what like fit the expectations of what Japanese cinema was supposed to do. And this obviously doesn't fit that, at least at the time it didn't. And so, yeah, so there's this big problem of like, they didn't want to do the film because it's just so out there, and not in what was the expectation of what a Japanese film director was supposed to be doing. But Toho also didn't want him because the only thing he had going for him was that he did commercials, which was considered a lesser form of filmmaking. And so not the same quality as making a commercially unsuccessful, very serious Japanese film versus a commercial, which would probably be quite, financially successful, because it's the whole purpose of a commercial. So yeah, so like they did have this problem of like they had to deal with the fact that a lot of the other films that they were making were not bringing in the audiences to make the film industry that profitable. We kind of live in a weird like golden age time, at least in the last like 30 years, where outside of some studios collapsing and there being some weird fuzzy studio math, like we're not like at a lot of dearth for the number of movies that we can watch. We have like excessive amounts of film that we could watch in any given year being released in multiple different ways and of all different types. But I guess in the 1970s, Japanese cinema didn't have that. It wasn't at the anywhere near the state that it is today, which is, I would say that Japanese cinema is quite advanced today. It's got a lot going for it. You can get basically fucking anything out of Japanese cinema these days, which is kind of lovely. So, yeah, so there's just like a lot of weird history of how this film got made. And in a weird way, some politics, I guess, some film politics.
And just, I guess I should clarify, when you're talking about a golden age, you were, like the last 30 years, were you, I guess, where were you referring to as that being a cinematic golden age?
I mean, I would say from a sort of Western perspective, just in terms of the amount of material in so many different varieties that we have access to, versus what I would like. I don't mean golden age like when we think of historical golden ages of like the height of film and how it rose out of the ashes and became the greatness. Like when we say like science fiction golden age of like the emergence. I mean more in terms of just accessibility.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, we can have access to more stuff of various kinds from different periods and across media than ever before. No, that's absolutely true. I think we have to counterbalance that with, at least from a theatrical perspective, of a comparatively more limited sort of offerings than we would have had say 40 years ago.
I think to some degree, yes and no. I think the problem is less the amount of offering and more what's getting pushed. So like, where I live, we're not getting like the really cool indie films. We're just never going to see them. We have one theater serving like basically 100 square miles of territory. I don't know of any other theater that's less than a 2-hour drive from here. Maybe there's one in Brainerd. I don't know. And so we got one theater, and of course, that theater needs to make a profit. So what is it going to show? It's going to show all of the films it knows are going to make money and put butts in seats, which are going to be the blockbusters, the stuff that gets lots of advertising. I think a lot of independent film and the sort of like what we might call with scare quotes like serious film is still being made, and there's still lots of that great stuff out there, but it's getting circulated in very specific camps.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. The terms of accessibility. I mean, in some ways, we can, we can get to see these much more easily than we would have, and yes, the stuff is out there. But the flip side is of what you said with theatrically much more difficult. Yeah,
like in the actual theater, certainly much more restricted. I mean, even when I lived in Gainesville, Florida, we got some Bollywood films. But mostly because there was a pretty sizable Indian community, and of course they want to watch some films from back home, so you'd get to see some like Amir Khan and stuff like that. But even then, like there's still some degree of limit. Like Gainesville had an independent theater, but like they can't show as much. So I think what I would say is part of what makes this the golden age is that in theaters, certainly we have a much significant limit, and so like a experimental surrealist film, whatever that would look like today, like House. We probably would not see that in theaters. You'd have to know to look for it, though, on like a streaming service, because it probably would be available on a streaming service. I mean, this one literally is, but that's just because it's been out long enough. So I think in a way we have access to it. The biggest problem I think now is kind of the same problem for this film, which is it's just in a different way because of the size of it, which is trying to get people to know that those other things exist, and it's not just all Marvel movies. I mean, people know, but like, you know what I mean? That like the big blockbusters aren't the only films. Like other films aren't just big action spectacles, and there are other types of cinema. At the same time, I also recognize that some people just literally want to go to a movie and just watch a bunch of like fantasy heroes punch each other because it's comforting.
Well, and of course, all of what we're saying also could be completely moot in that who knows what the state of the industry is going to be as we move ahead, since right now none of us can see movies in the theaters. As we are speaking, we are seeing new releases going directly to video on demand
at a significant upcharge of what you'd pay if you went to the movie theater.
Right. Yes. But we're looking at the possibility of that window that has existed up until now between the theatrical release and some kind of home release disappearing altogether. And who knows what the months ahead are going to bring. So right now we're obviously in a period of gigantic uncertainty on so many fronts. Never mind the film industry, but speaking with the film industry, we don't know where we're going. Now, admittedly, that's taking us well off House, but I thought I would just mention as a bit of a side issue with regards to some of its, not so much its influences, but what it has subsequently influenced and its tradition. And we talked about the American slapstick horror films, but I should also mention Takashi Miike's The Happiness of the Katakuris from 2001, which is It's kind of in the same vein as House. Its Wikipedia entry calls it a musical comedy horror film, which, that's not entirely inaccurate. I mean, it's got claymation and has monsters, and there's this the opening scene, which involves monsters and soups and uvulas, has to be seen to be believed. I don't think it's as successful a film as House, but it is certainly a spiritual descendant, very clearly, of House. And in Takashi Miike, we certainly have a director whose filmography, to call it eclectic, would be to vastly understate the case. So perhaps some more connections there.
I wonder too, you're making me think of the 1998 film Biozombie. It's a Hong Kong zombie comedy film, which is not quite as weird as House. I mean, it has a lot of weirdness and there's some like weird, I think they go to a sushi diner at one point for some reason, because they're basically in a mall. And it's meant to be a spoof of Dawn of the Dead. For those that don't know, that's the George Romero that has them locked up in the mall. Both versions have that. So it made me think of that when you were kind of talking of the kind of, wonder if there's some crossover influence there, because it is a somewhat silly film. It's very much aware, though, that it is a comedy. Maybe there's that aspect that's not quite the same, but it's got some of that same kind of weirdness and slapstickery that you kind of get in House, just maybe with slightly less of that surrealist bent, I guess.
Yeah, and not having seen that one, I'll take your word on that. But I wonder if one of the things that we're not seeing as clearly in some of the other films is there is some thematic heft to House as well, right?
Yeah.
That everything that's going on is also, it's a kind of twisted coming of age story. The film is suffused with the burgeoning sexuality and the anxieties surrounding that, and parental and child resentments, and the forging of one's own identity, and the idea of one's identity being consumed. We're getting the literalization of the body in pieces fantasy. I mean, there's a lot that is going into the rather heady mix of this film's meal.
Yeah, I mean, you were making me think a lot about there are a lot of different thematics here. So one of them is Obayashi explicitly included World War II discussions here,
Yes.
because many of the people he knows suffered from the bombing in Hiroshima, as I recall.
Yeah, I gather all of his childhood friends were killed.
Yeah, so it clearly had a very significant impact. And so there are elements of this, because as you mentioned much earlier when we were recording, the aunt, stayed behind in that house, in part because the man that she loved went off to war and obviously never came back. And so there's this very clear awareness of the damage and consequences of the war, and obviously things like Hiroshima, etc., on Japanese culture. But then you also have this other element, which is, you have all these problems of like dead people in families in here. And so the other one is with Gorgeous and her father, because Ryoko is this woman who shows up and is going to essentially be her new mother, is the way the father frames it, because she's getting married, right? And she would, in U.S. culture, I guess we would say stepmom, but I don't know if that's a thing in Japan. But it very clearly makes it clear, right, to us that she is meant to be the replacement. Like, she's going to be your new mom. And the immediate reaction is exactly what you'd expect from a teenager, having somebody come in that they don't really know, who is replacing someone they love very much who has died, which is she gets upset about it and decides, I'm going to go stay with my aunt in the house. But Ryoko shows up at the end as well, so it's actually in a way kind of like the frame of the entire film, because when Ryoko shows up thinking that what she's going to do is soothe things over and like earn the affections of her stepdaughter, she meets Gorgeous, but Gorgeous effectively burns her all away, while also giving us probably the most creepy set of lines in the entire film, which is her talking about how all her friends are asleep, but they're all going to wake up and they're going to be very, very hungry, which is super creepy. And I love that line. That line is one of my favorites. But yeah, she burns away Ryoko at the end. And so rather than having a reunification of, I guess what you might say is the nuclear family, that family is permanently destroyed.
Well, and of course, that that's something that looks like Gorgeous, but is more probably the aunt or whatever the figure was, right? Because in fact, Gorgeous meets her demise about half, 2/3 of the way through the film, when she's sitting in front of the mirror and is consumed by flame.
Yeah.
So that's the aunt that we're seeing at the end, though she now seems to have permanently adopted the appearance of Gorgeous.
Oh, it wasn't clear to me that it was the aunt. I was under the impression that some of the people who are consumed become part of the house, like permanently. They become the souls that are consuming the other people that come in.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a good point. I shouldn't say. I mean, I shouldn't be too definitive about that being the aunt, because I'm now applying a kind of narrative certainty that isn't really there in the film.
Yeah.
So we have a thing that might be the spirit of Gorgeous. It might be the aunt that looks like Gorgeous. Might be the embodiment of the force within the house. Who knows? The fact that some of the victims seem to be quite cheery about the way that they meet their ends, and their personalities are still retained, suggests a complexity to the situation that can't be reduced to, it's the aunt who consumed them all in order to become young. That side of things is there, but that simplifies the film in a reductive way. It is a film that defies a neat and tidy explanation or resolution.
Yeah, I think that's very true, because for those who eventually are going to watch this, I think it's going to become very clear that your expectations of what kind of film you're getting at any given point is going to be probably subverted. Because so much of this film, at times it gives you very clear responses to things of like, oh, but that's exactly what you would think it is, and that's that. And at other times it just deliberately obfuscates what is really going on. I mean, the example I think is when they're all in the water, right, and they're sort of floating, and they realize they're floating, but they're supposed to destroy the cat thing, the picture of the cat, because this cat keeps showing up throughout the story, right? This beautiful white fluffy cat keeps showing up, and then there's this portrait of the cat that's sort of a creepy portrait that's on the wall, and so they decide, well, we just need to destroy it, and that'll take care of it, because it'll, like, in a traditional film, right, we might expect that would be the thing that ends this, and then the remaining members survive, and then they're traumatized and they go on about their lives, because a lot of horror films have that, right, where you just need to figure out the thing that ends it. There's a mini mystery, figure out the thing that destroys the big bad, and then they just, they have to be sad about the fact that their friends are dead. But in this film, that's not what happens. Because when they destroy it, there's blood and there's screams and all of that, but the house still consumes them. That doesn't help them get away.
And that scene of the blood spewing out of the cat's mouth and leading to the flood certainly anticipates the geyser of blood coming out of the wall in Evil Dead 2 a decade later. But and also the lack of destruction of the big bad, though, that also very squarely places House in the 70s, because certainly from particularly 1968 onwards, the horror film where the big bad is not destroyed, where in fact the big bad is triumphant, becomes very, very common. And
you would know that because you're the horror dork on this show.
Well, and to come back to Burnt Offerings from the year before, the house is completely triumphant. It devours its victims, and that's that.
It's really strange because, I have obviously, I was thinking like Hereditary would be an example where the big bad effectively wins. A very different film than this, obviously. And there are obviously films that love to do that. And maybe there's something about, a lot of them are horror films, and maybe there's something about the fact that horror films can do that makes them so attractive for some people. Because for the most part, right, if you think about any other film genre, usually the bad guy loses, right? They might win in some specific ways, right? Like they might kill some characters or something like that. But generally, the bad guy loses. The bad guy doesn't win. I mean, like James Bond's like the weird exception because the bad guy loses and he gets away, but eventually he gets caught and he's dead. And that's sort of what, in most forms of film, that's what happens with the bad thing or the bad person. It's weird that in some horror films it's the opposite way. And maybe there's some aspect of like the terror of realizing that you can lose in these situations, and maybe that's part of what's going on.
Well, certainly the evil could not win, at least in, let's say, the Hollywood film, because of the production code running up through into the 60s. But though you had, well, as we saw with Val Lewton's The Seventh Victim, with the suicide at the end of that, that's one of the big exception to that rule. Mario Bava's Black Sunday in 1963, it's an anthology horror film, and one of its stories, the Verdelak with Boris Karloff, ends with evil triumphant. So we have that precursor coming out of Italy in 63. But then in 1968, we have Night of the Living Dead and Rosemary's Baby, where our hero is shot dead at the end of one, and the Antichrist is embraced by his mother at the end of the other. And from then on, you have, and there's also the Fearless Vampire Killers, which, again, horror comedy, just so another Polanski film just prior to this, where evil wins. But certainly from 68 onwards through the 70s, lots and lots and lots of horror films where evil triumphs. But lots and lots of films in general where that happens, particularly in thrillers, right? This is after all, the era of The Conversation and of Chinatown, and the bleak ending, right? And you have a lot of darkness coming out of American cinema in the late 60s through the mid 70s, in the period of the American film Renaissance, reflecting the anxieties and traumas of of a nation coming through the double whammy of Vietnam and Watergate, among other things. So the idea that good is triumphant is a bit of an open question in so many horror, so many films of the 70s, and horror is very much part of that. So Star Wars in 1977, in some ways, is like a course correction of that kind. But you watch a thriller from any time in the 70s, and you can flip a coin as to whether or not you're going to get a happy ending. And now we get sort of spikes up and down. Now, in the last several years, we've seen something of that darkness, I think, come back into films. And I'm running the risk of oversimplifying things way too much here, but you do see certain trends in that regard. And so films like Hereditary and Midsommar and The Witch, horror films where the darkness unequivocally triumphs, seem to be more common again, even though we certainly have plenty of counterexamples as well. But I don't know that we're seeing that to the same degree in say, like, again, the crime or the thriller film, which so often went dark, black hole dark in the 70s.
Well, yeah, you're right, because I was thinking Bad Lieutenant, for example. Well, I guess it's a little different because he's kind of bad from the start, so...
Yeah, and that's okay. So now we're that's the 90s there, though, and the thing is, that's also a film that's that's obsessed with the idea of redemption. Though, where does Abel Ferrara get his start? Driller Killer in the 70s.
Yeah, you're right. I hate that
45.
movie. I hate that movie so much. Oh, I found it unwatchable.
It's an acquired taste.
Well, it's an acquired taste if your acquired taste is battery acid. But no, I'm just throwing out a bunch of stuff because I'm trying to think of examples of exactly what you're saying. But maybe we are in a new, or at least seeing an emerging trend where that's happening more in films now. But I don't know. This film is that's something that for me was an immediate reaction, was the way that this film ends, and none of the people that we're supposed to be rooting for, or theoretically rooting for, survive. They're all dead.
No. And yet the film remains resolutely cheerful about that, too.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing. It's not the conversation. It's fun.
That's part of the creepiness of this, is that it is weirdly cheerful about its ending. I mean, even the teacher who gets turned into bananas, that is just, it is bananas. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. It's completely random.
And like he screams at one point, like, I'm turning into bananas or something like that. And then he turns into bananas. It's like, okay, it's just, he's dead, but he's now going to be eaten. Like, what's happening, David?
And the soundtrack is just perfect for all of this too.
Yeah, because at times it is like syrupy sweet.
Yeah. And knowingly so.
Very much so. Yeah, on purpose. But in any case, we've kind of hit an hour point here. I think we need to...
I think so.
We need to switch over to talking about what I am picking for us to watch next.
What have you picked for us next, Shaun?
I have picked what I would consider to be a veritable classic that has been snubbed by the Academy for too damn long. And that is a film that will take us across the East China Sea, from where we are right now with House, to 1985, some roughly 8-ish years later, to a film starring none other than the greatest kung fu master, comedy kung fu master probably ever, Jackie Chan, to a film called Police Story.
Oh, excellent.
Which is the film that essentially broke Jackie Chan outside of the Chinese market into international waters. It was the film that made him... eventually would make him into the star that he is today, which is, as a reminder to everybody, Jackie Chan is, as of this recording, 66 years old, and yet can still do a backflip and throw himself between the steps of a ladder.
Impressive.
I don't even know what to do. I can barely hobble. But Jackie Chan is like throwing himself up buildings, and he's in his 60s. So we're going to watch Police Story, also known as Police Force sometimes, and I'm really looking forward to this film because I think it would be nice to get something that is not from the West, that is also very fun and exciting, and Jackie Chan films are all of those things.
All right, look forward to it.
Perfect. Well, if folks want to let us know what they think about House, or Hausu, it's sometimes referred to, you can obviously send us emails, skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. You can go to their Twitter account, @skiffyandfanty. You can find me at Shaun Duke, and where can they find you, David?
You can find me on Twitter at David_Annandale.
And then your website?
DavidAnnandale.com.
Perfect. And if folks want to support us, they can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. And all that. Other than that, that's kind of all we got. So we're Pretentious Stout.
Bye.
Bye. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter @skiffyandfanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.